One of the most pervasive issues in human history is what should the relationship of the military to society be? That is, should the military be completely separate? Should the military run society? Should there be some sort of mixture of the two? Whether or not the military should be independent, the governing institution, or under civilian control is something that we have going back as far as ancient Rome. And I find in times of frustration, people will frequently say, I wish there was just a military coup and the army would just take over and run things, and they'll make a better society because you'll get rid of the problems of democracy, etc. The issue is traditionally the army has a very bad track record of running society. And ironically enough, the military has the worst track record at running wars. The military tends to be awful whenever you have a coup, whenever you have a junta. There are very few examples I can think of in history where a junta actually did good fighting a civilian controlled military or just a war in general. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. One of them is the military only really views wars in a military perspective. And that might be a weird thing to say as like a criticism. But war, as Clausewitz put it, is politics by other means. You don't go to war for the sake of going to war. You go to war to accomplish some sort of political objective. Even if that political objective is just to humble your opponents or to prove your strength, that's the goal of the war. You always have to enter a war with an exit plan, or rather a plan for victory. What will victory look like? When will the war end? This is important with most things in life. If you start a government program, if you go to school or something, there needs to be an exit plan and there needs to be a goal you're going for. And one of the issues with military-run governments is they don't think about things in a political sense. So probably the best example of this, and this might strike people as a weird example because it kind of goes against common wisdom, or conventional wisdom rather, is the case of Vietnam. So the conventional wisdom on Vietnam is America lost the war because politicians interfered too much with the military. So there's a lecture series I listened to about modern military strategy, and their contention was the problem with Vietnam wasn't that politicians interfered too much. The problem with Vietnam was politicians didn't interfere enough. And kind of one of the issues that they came across is there was no clear political objective in Vietnam. With the army running the show, they basically focused on kill ratios, how many Viet Cong or Northern Vietnamese regulars they could kill while taking the least casualties themselves. But there was no real political plan. There was no real exit strategy. And when they finally kind of tried to come up with one with Vietnamization, it didn't really work particularly well. Largely because they had overthrown DM, who were really the only chance of holding the country together. So the Vietnam War just kind of rapidly descended into a slugfest that went on for decades with very little in the way of resolution. There wasn't really a how do we win, how do we get out. It's just we're going to keep killing people until something changes. So that I think is kind of the archetypical example. Another one we have is during the Arab-Israeli wars. And this is kind of where we start to get into, I think it is actually very important that the military is controlled by civilians, because it just doesn't seem to work otherwise. One of the big problems, and this is something we saw during the Six-Day War in particular, is having a tradition of civilian control of the military means that they can give a lot more autonomy to commanders. Like in Israel, for instance, there's the military has always been under civilian control. The military has always been highly trusted. So the politicians can basically let generals do what they want. They can cooperate very closely with them. They can give them a lot of autonomy, etc. Whereas most of the Arab countries that they were facing off against were either military dictatorships or regimes that had been brought to power during coups. And because of that, they were very well aware of the potential for coups, so they were very reluctant to give their soldiers any kind of autonomy, to give generals any kind of autonomy. Some of the things, like one of the things they often will do in Arab countries is they'll have a balance of power approach, where they'll put multiple commanders who are like rivals against each other. They will prevent coordination between different units, all kinds of stuff like that. Because there's the ever present fear that the armies they send after Israel are just as likely, if not more so, to just turn around and overthrow, be it the Syrian or the Egyptian government or whatever. And you can't operate a war under those circumstances. A kind of a similar issue when you don't have civilian governance of the military is there's no grounds for legitimacy. Having a established system of succession, be it like what we have in the United States, where elections are widely accepted, or in monarchies where one king succeeds another. Without having that, what you get is rule by the strong. And a lot of people say, oh, rule by the strong, that sounds really good. But when there's no legitimacy, every man's his own king. So any military officer who has a gun and has a couple soldiers, if he can overthrow the current regime, then he can set up his own, and that's more or less considered legitimate. And there's nothing really holding people back. One of the reasons why the American Constitution works so well is because it's widely accepted. Most of America, at least tacitly, accepts the Constitution, accepts it as the legitimate law of the land, and kind of views it as the default. So for most people, the idea of one president not succeeding another if they're elected is just something that realistically, I know people will talk about, oh, we need a coup, we need presidents for life, etc. But it's just something the average person doesn't think about. The idea of the military overthrowing the president and setting up their own regime is something that's seen as just completely like unconscionable. It's just something they don't think will ever happen. And that's very effective, and I think that's one of the main reasons why Israel does so much better than Arab countries in wars. So some other examples of this were Japan. I think is a good example because Japan, for most of its existence as a country, has been a military dictatorship. Or it depends how far back you want to say Japan was a country. But the shogunates were a military dictatorship, and the military suffered horrendously under them. It just became very bureaucratic, corrupt, incapable of adapting to modern times. The period where the Japanese army was probably the best was during prior to World War I, when, from my understanding, the army was much more under civilian control during the Meiji era and the immediate aftermath, and they did a very good job against the Russians and the Chinese, etc. By World War II, Japan was basically a military dictatorship in all but name, and the army did an absolutely horrendous job running things. The fact that the how do you pronounce it, Kwangtung army was able to, without any oversight or direction from the mainland, just invade Manchuria, set up its own like independent state, and just continue conquering China on its own, really speaks to how bad centralized control of the Japanese armed forces was. Also, the Navy and Army hated each other, and they actively tried to undermine one another. And the Japanese army just, part of it was they were just kind of, there's an expression, high off of their own supply, which refers to like drug dealers who take their own drugs, and it just doesn't work out very well. And I think that kind of happened with the Japanese in World War II, is they just like made just these horrendous strategic and logistical situations because they believed in their own invincibility. And once again, there wasn't really a clear, in my opinion at least, political objective. It was just to grab as much stuff as they possibly could. And it ultimately just kind of turned into a disaster. And you had them just occupying all these like random islands. They invaded the Alaskan islands. That was viewed as a good idea. They invaded Burma. They just went after basically everybody. And they just, in my view, kind of just sought military solutions for everything. There was no exit strategy for the war. There is no kind of definition of what victory would look like. And I guess just very briefly, another probably the best example of this is how poorly the junta did against the UK during the Falkland Island War. It was an absolute and total disaster. It showed military men don't necessarily know how to run a war without any kind of civilian oversight. So I guess you could say another example of this, and maybe kind of one of the better modern examples, was the Spring Offensive. By the end of World War One, Germany had become a de facto military dictatorship under Ludendorff and Hindenburg. And Ludendorff, in my view, really didn't know what he was doing. He was a good strategist. He was a good with logistics, but near the end of the war, they decided to launch the Spring Offensive. See, what had happened is Russia had surrendered to Germany at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and Germany was able to relocate a good portion of its soldiers to the Western Front. With a temporary numerical superiority and more American troops arriving by the day, Germany figured this was going to be its last chance. They're going to put all their money and all their resources and all their soldiers into one last final attack. And I think the failure of the Spring Offensive, it probably was doomed to fail regardless, but it did much worse because there was no clear objective. Ludendorff's plan was, we're just going to do it as we go. Commanders are just going to take advantage of the tactical situation on the ground. So there was no clear objective. The objective wasn't to beat Paris, to take Paris. The objective wasn't encirclement. It was just to kill as many people as possible, take as much ground as possible. But there was no real overall plan, I guess you could say. And that was one of kind of the many reasons why it was a total failure. They killed a lot of Allied soldiers, but it actually left them in a worse strategic position. And to a certain extent, I blame, once again, the lack of civilian control on that. So I guess the final case, and this is kind of an example of how it can play out over the long term, was in ancient Rome. So Rome is kind of an interesting case because you could kind of argue to a certain extent it was a military republic because the military was the largest focus of the state. Even so, though, generals were very much subject to civilian government, even if they kind of shared dual roles. Like my understanding is a proconsul would often be leader of the local armies, and the consul was the highest ranked general. Well, both consuls were the highest ranked generals, and they would often lead field armies. But there was a principle where generals just wouldn't go off and do their own thing. Generals weren't supposed to go off and do their own thing. They were supposed to follow the orders of the Senate and the consul. And for a lot of Roman history, the army was very trusted. They were able to basically let the army fight their own wars without that much intervention because there was this sense of trust between them. There was this sense that they could rely upon the army. And ultimately, one of the things that screwed Rome is when they got rid of the principle of civilian control of the military. Like when you start to get into the late Republic period with like Sulla and Caesar and Gaius Marius and all these people, they basically got rid of the idea of civilian control of the military, and it just degenerated into whoever had the strongest army could march on Rome and make themselves leader, regardless of what the election results were, and regardless of position and the Roman Constitution and all these established things that had been put in place to ensure things like a regular succession of power. And this just kind of got worse as time went on. And once you get into the imperial era, the Roman Empire just becomes a flat-out military dictatorship. And you have like the period of the barracks emperors where you have something like 20 emperors in 30 years. And just any commander who could raise a decent-sized army was able to either break away and make his own empire or to take over the march on Rome. And it basically meant that emperors couldn't trust their commanders anymore because any competent commander they'd have would tend to march on Rome and overthrow them, or his troops would proclaim him emperor and he would have to do it. So while civilian governments can be very incompetent, they may not know what they're doing, that kind of thing, the ability to have an army that has a certain level of trust and that you can be reasonably sure isn't going to overthrow the state and constantly lead to political instability often kind of drastically outweighs it. It's kind of like what happens with primogeniture. If you have the principle that the oldest son always inherits, that's going to lead to a lot of incompetent kings. But it's better to have that than what they had in the Byzantine Empire or the Roman Empire, where it was kind of de facto succession by the strongest or the most fit. And everybody thought they were the strongest or the most fit. And since there was no legally enshrined principle of succession, there was just kind of endless streams of coups and counter coups. I recommend reading the Alexiad at some point, which was written by Anna Karenina about her father. And in the first, like, 3 or 4 chapters of the book, there's literally, like, 5 coups and civil wars. It was just a total disaster. So I guess what I'm saying is, well, civilian control of the military can and often does lead to bad results. The benefits of it far outweigh the shortcomings. So those are kind of my thoughts on the matter. I haven't done a history video in a while, so I hope people found this interesting. As always, this is Argent. We must dissent.